This tells the history of the Polytechnic from 1838 until 1881, with a little bit extra what happened after 1881 that I've represented in 11 cabinets. The first cabinet is this one, which shows the development of the outside of the building, which is only a single building in 1838, with below is the architect's diagram plan for it. And then over the next few years, it gradually expanded. It overtook the building next door, and it now became like this. And in a few years later, by 1854, it now has as this is. And if we go back to the first image, we have on the roof a statue of Minerva. One thing she was patron of was the arts. And to the right is a pyramid of glass, which was Richard Talbot's photographic daguerreotype studio, where he operated for nearly 2 years. People went up and had their portraits photographed. Very important feature. These are postcards from the late 1890s of what the Polytechnic looked like and the church. And we go from the 1890s postcard to this postcard where we're showing it had become the Polytechnic Christian Institute. On the bottom we've got the architect's drawing of the plan and the dimensions and the layout of the Great Hall and the entertainments and machinery that's going to be inside. And one of the most famous things the Polytechnic is known for is the Great Diving Bell. Now this O Panorama is a Portuguese piece of document of 1838 that shows the diving bell and a diver. And the diving bell was operating until the very end at the closure of the Polytechnic 44 years later. And these represent drawings and sketches of what the insides look like. Almost every illustration I found, it's different because the insides were changing. There were canals, there were machinery. They were known for the latest inventions. So the Polytechnic always introduced the very latest, what was happening in the electrical scientific world. And they had demonstrations. They had demonstrations of steam machines. They had demonstrations of fountains and boats going up and down, optical toys. Here we've got the Wheel of Life, which is a wonderful caricature of a face, which is a working model. Over on the other side of this image, we've got like Kew Gardens, a little aquarium of plants growing. Behind that, we've got L-Apps, which is a giant spark machine that produces at least a 3-foot spark. Perhaps that's Professor Pepper standing in front of it, ready to talk about it. And behind that, there's the lighthouse and the diving bell. And up in the gods here is a mechanical figure of Leotard, who went the whole length of the hall mechanically and back again, doing somersaults. Another interesting feature of this drawing is the fact that there's a magic lantern show going on in the small gallery, and we can see the queue of people queuing up to see The Shadowless Man, a show by Alfred Cadman. A series of 16 magic lantern slides were being shown. What is particularly nice is this drawing has been made by Alfred Cadman, and we have an example of the slide from that show on view in another cabinet. Henry Child, before he started work at the Polytechnic, he was painting slides apparently for Mr. Robertson for his Phantasmagoria shows, and he soon went on to produce his own slides for the Delphi Theatre of the Flying Dutchman. And here we have a poster from 1827 that advertises the Flying Dutchman and the Phantom ship in full sail, with not the actual slide he used, but a sort of early slide from the 1840s of the ship, the Flying Dutchman, and the spectre of it behind, with other similar sheets advertising the show, because the show probably ran for 15 years. It was a very, very popular show in London, and it travelled around England as well. The next posters show Mr. Child's own shows at the theatres. We've got scenic views here, showing the various effects of light and shade, painted and exhibited by Mr. Child expressly for this theatre, the Adelphi Theatre at the Strand. They mention just above that, animated picture, a London company. Well, that's nothing to do with the slides. That was just a term that they used for pictures that changed, painted pictures rather than lantern slides. But there's a whole description of Mr. Child's lantern slides, some of which we are familiar with today, because the scenes like the Mill and the North Pole and Storm with Shipwreck are very much liked and shown today by modern lanternists. The next sheet is again the New Strand Theatre, with astronomy and the seasons, zodiac, oratories, and Mr. Child's Fairy Dreams, with another list of some of the new slides he would have painted. He was an excellent painter. And here we've got the polar regions with Captain Ross, and the Victory in 1830, Eskimo Village, Aurora Borealis, all before the Polytechnic opened. And here the Colosseum, which only lasted a few years. In 1836 we have Mr. Child's Dissolvent Views. This is only a facsimile, but it's very important to have. A few years later, probably 1842, Mr. Child joined the Polytechnic and became the doyen of the Magic Lantern slide. His paintings, he worked at the Polytechnic until he died, aged about 89, 90 when he died. And while at the time he was at the Polytechnic, he took under his wing new artists. He taught them his tricks of the trade, and he had 2 or 3 artists during that time learning the business. But he was always there as the father figure of the Magic Lantern slide, and the inventor of the chromatrope. And here we have some very fine chromatropes with his name, Henry Child, Professor of Optics and painter of glass slides, and inventor of the chromatrope. These are string-tied chromatropes that revolve round in opposite directions to produce beautiful kaleidoscopic views on the screen. This one being of a fountain, another idea of Mr. Child, who combined the effect of a painted fountain with water seamlessly coming up in the air and flowing down by bands of swirling colours, usually blue and black, revolving in opposite directions. If you come round the side, one can get another view of that slide. The other very important figure at the Polytechnic in those days, in the 1840s, 50s, was Professor Pepper. And we know of Professor Pepper from his Pepper's Ghost. And the Ghost begins in 1864 with his patent for the Ghost, which was a joint project between Mr. Henry Dirks with his publication here of 1864, The Ghost, the Spectrodrama, the Dirksian Phantasmagoria, as is named the book, and the patent that Mr. Pepper and Mr. Dirk and Mr. Tobin produced. And Pepper went on to develop this, and it became a very, very popular show, running for 20 or 30 years, and is still shown today when the conditions are correct. But Mr. Dirks rather took umbrage, and there was a bit of a legal dispute about who owned the copyright to this show, which was very unfortunate because every time Professor Pepper produced the show, he always credited Mr. Dirks in any case. And the money didn't come to Mr. Pepper, it came to the establishment of the Polytechnic itself. So I think his argument was a little bit pointless. This shows what happens beneath the stage, where an actor or a ghost or a spectre or whatever, very bright oxyhydrogen lamp is shone onto him. He then is projected by a mirror up onto a sheet of glass on the stage. This diagram will show that. The spectre below is with the mirror reflecting the image up onto the plate of glass. To the audience, all they can see, they can't see the plate of glass, all they can see is the reflection, which visually looks like it's on the stage. And being on the stage, the ghost can act, when it's carefully rehearsed, with the actors on the stage. It may be someone asleep or someone reading a book, or it could be a duel between sword fighters, one below stage and one on the stage, and then suddenly the ghost can appear and disappear at will, and move about on the stage. And these are just other examples as published in Illustrated London Newses. It was used in so many different plays and theatres like Hamlet and Macbeth, and modern stories, I say modern, 1860 stories could be written by Mr. Pepper on how to use the ghost. And he became so popular with this that almost every entertainment show featured the ghost in one form or the other.
Yes, the white one where the... I can't... Oh, no. Just no. Come on, sound effect. That's it.
This is a Pepper's Ghost unit built for the series of lectures at Westminster University last year. It was called the Pepper's Ghost series of lectures. Without Pepper's Ghost, nobody knew what Pepper's Ghost was. So this was built just for that. So here we have it. Power on. We have an empty coffin, but with the right sound effects. In 3D space, up comes the skeleton. And as the lighting ratio is changed, the skeleton comes and goes, and it's gone, purely by illuminating the skeleton that's at 45 degrees off the mirror. Down there, click, click. I forgot. It doesn't matter what you overlap. No matter where it was pulled out. When you miss places, that's it. Click. And that's all there is to Pepper's Ghost.
The other very famous person connected to the Polytechnic was William Hill. He was one of the finest painters. Will and Child worked together, and Mr. Hill trained under Mr. Child, and they were very, very fine painters. I think in general, Mr. Hill was the better of them, but between them they painted over 1,000 large plates of slides for the Polytechnic. We are lucky one of our members owns Mr. Hill's paint box, and that is shown here. That was handed down by his granddaughter to the collector in question. And in the bottom drawer of the paint box were these little sketches that Mr. Hill made and paint washes of things that he may have had in mind to do. In about 1898, he was involved in an accident riding a horse. So he couldn't paint after that. Also in the box were some lantern slides, and they are in a display in another cabinet. It's just amazing that this is one artefact that survives and is in a personal collection. The cabinet is just representative of some of the shows they put on at the Polytechnic in its life of 42 years. Spiritualism was something that was featured for a short while. These are invitations to shows, Raleigh's Queer Dream, and a particularly interesting show called Curried Prawns. As time went on, they made up stranger and stranger titles to encourage the people to come. People came to the Polytechnic to be entertained, and children loved coming here because there were so many amusing things to see. Here we have a sailor being sort of on an electric shock machine, and the voltage is being gradually turned up, and the children howl with laughter when he suddenly lets go of it and pulls the weirdest faces. This is what the projectors look like at the back of the hall. Giant lanterns. There are many other illustrations of giant lanterns. Up to 6 were used at some times. This is a typical program from the 1850s, showing views in China with the irrigating wheel, the Chinese temple, burial place, and a Mandarin in-state, and a street in Canton, curiosities of vision, and a tour through space, which would be an astronomical show. That's early 1850s. But these two pieces are particularly poignant because towards the end of 1881, they wanted to shut the Polytechnic. And there was such a public demand to keep it open that the officials kept it open for a further 2 weeks. Here it says until September the 10th, 1881. This particular programme didn't change, but this is dated August the 30th, 1881, and is the only programme we know of this particular day and date. This programme is mentioning Mr. Wilkie, who went on to, when the Polytechnic closed, he was a commercial artist, and he painted many, many thousands of slides to commission for the public, and I believe he also painted for the big houses like Newton and Hughes and Watson, who all wanted his slides, because Mr. Wilkie was an animator. He loved the slides, he loved dissolving views. He wanted his slides to look as natural as possible on the screen, so he invented new effects and articulated slides. And here we have the programme of one of his last shows, Reflections of the Rhineland. This cabinet represents the paintings, some of the paintings that the Polytechnic painters painted. And we start with Mr. Hill. This section here is a sample of Mr. Hill's paintings, the Christmas Carol and Christmas Customs. Large format slides that were famous, and at the Polytechnic they showed them very often at Christmas time. And after the Polytechnic closed in 1881, the artist, Mr. Hill, had his own business. He painted slides on commission. And these smaller slides are the slides that he painted for customers. And he sold as his business. People could buy individually, or he was commissioned to paint. These 3 paintings here, we think are his very last paintings because they were found in the paint box that you saw in the other cabinet, just those 3. There are 3 slides here. The only 3 we know of are with the label of Child and Dubell. Now, Dubell was a young apprentice under Mr. Child. Mr. Child was already in his 80s, and Mr. Dubell was about 17, 18 years old. And these 3 slides are all we know about, which is brilliant to have them here. And this is a water carrier and a lamplighter and the night watchman. Beautiful scene there. And this slide above the rainbow is a cabbage painted by Mr. Child, 66 Vauxhall Walk. A cabbage seems rather a dull subject, but another slide, which we don't have, was of a tailor. And the cabbage and the tailor, I think a lot of people will have a slip slide of the cabbage and the tailor. It's a very well-known slide. But this is 2 separate slides, it would have been. And coming back to the cabinet, we have Mr. Wilkie's slides. These are beautiful painted slides from the 1870s. Mr. Wilkie was painting for the Polytechnic. He started again as an apprentice, age about 15 in 1872. And these are Christmas customs, very similar to the ones you saw by Mr. Hill, because Mr. Hill was his tutor and Wilkie was in great admiration of his skills and techniques. which is incorporated into his own. This scene here is of a Bulgarian church. There was a whole series of slides about Bulgaria and the Bulgarian people, and Mr. Wilkie painted every slide individually. This is a particularly wonderful slide of Tivoli, Sybil's Temple, and it was a very romantic spot that many artists went to in the mid-50s, 1850s. Again, after the Poly closed, Mr. Wilkie had his own business. He painted slides to order. This is a particularly interesting set of exploding a ship with a torpedo, and it was a series of about 3, 4 or 5 slides. Shipwreck above, turmoil sea, thunder and lightning. Again, a sequence of 4 or 5 slides ending in this disaster, tempest at sea. Those were hand-painted slides. These are photographic slides that were painted by Wilkie, and because he's commissioned for so much material, he cannot spend a day or two painting each slide. He bought the photographs for these and he just hand-coloured them. He specialised in dissolving views, so he created the day and the night scene. And here we show the effect at night of where he has hand-painted all the lights, the beam at the top and the portico at the front illuminated by oxyhydrogen spotlights. This slide is painted by Mr. Clare, and his signature is on the slide and the date, 1854. And it's based on a Cruikshank engraving of the rent day. The family whose rent is due make a midnight flit to vacate the property before the landlord comes in the morning. One of a sequence of many slides that this is the only one we know to exist. And their material for Polytechnic slides is so rare that we are very fortunate to have these examples. There are very few examples other than in museums. This slide by Mr. A. Cadman, Albert Cadman, was recently found by one of our Magic Lantern members at an antique fair. It was framed like an ordinary picture, and he saw that it was sort of painted on glass, so he thought that could be a Polytechnic slide. He asked me, did I know a Mr. Cadman? I said yes. He was a Polytechnic designer and painter, and he described the picture to me, and it involves long shadows, and that reminded me of a story I've heard, and I found the reading and the story and the time it was projected, the show was given, and in the 1870s. And I mentioned earlier, in the first cabinet, there was an inside picture of the Polytechnic, and there was a group of people queuing to see the Shadowless Man, and this is one of the plates from the Shadowless Man. These two are commercial slides designed by Mr. Cadman. They are glimpses of old London. They are quite common. I'm sure some members will have them in their collection if they look. And the signature A. Cadman is where that little arrow is on each of the slides. But it's so tiny, you need an eyeglass to see the signature. You've got to spend quite a while trying to find it. The 2 slides above, that is Bluebeard. And again, a series of 12 slides of Bluebeard, engraved outline, hand-coloured, and again designed by Mr. Cadman, and his signature is where the arrows are. That set exists as a series of transfer slides of 12 by Theobald, and I'm sure many people they'll recognise those images. Mr. Cadman designed them. His name has been rubbed off the transfers. This beautiful slide of Bubbles, a lever slide with the pipe that bobs into the water, then comes up to his mouth, and is advertising Pear's soap, designed by Millet in 1884. On the other side of the slide, as it's a photographic outline, that Mr. John Green is responsible for the photographic work, also put his own motif on John Green 1886 and turned it into a lever slide, obviously with permission of Millet. and Pears probably commissioned him to do something to advertise Pear soap. The slide above is a John Green slide. It's hard to see when it's illuminated. The John Green motif is on the top of the slide, and there's the word copyright on the top of the slide. You can tell it's a very peculiar slide, and it has 3 slippers. I've removed the slippers to make all the heads visible at once. The slide above is another John Green slide, and a triple slipper. Her nose changes shape, it grows forward and then it turns up at the end, and her eye moves back and forth. Another John Green slide, his commercial work, on the pouch by the river is the initials JG, and it's the Zulu War, a series of 50 slides. And though this is the title slide, it's painted, the other 49 are taken from an illustrated London News and coloured by John Green or his company. This slide is also designed by John Green. It's from Christmas Carol. Though it's taken from the book, it has been redesigned by Mr. Green. It's not exactly as the illustration in the back. This is another artist from the Polytechnic who is up till now unknown. His name is E. Akers, and we think he may be the father of a C. Akers. We've got advertisements from him in the 1880s saying that he's been connected with the Polytechnic for many years. And this is the other slide I have by Mr. Akers. Now, 1 or 2 people have mentioned that Mr. Akers may be associated with Bert Akers, father of or uncle to. That's more evidence we need to find in the future. This slide is particularly interesting. It is painted on 3 layers of glass to give it depth and luminosity and special effect. Not sure what series it's from. I call it the Fairy Grotto, and I believe it may be the Queen of the Fairies, Calypso, coming up from below the water and appearing in that scene with all her entourage of fairies surrounding her. Along here is the Children in the Woods, painted by Hill. Beautiful quality slide. And Mr. Fezziwig here dancing under the mistletoe, the Charles Dickens story. This slide is by Mr. Collins of the Polytechnic. He seems to be stationed at the Polytechnic where he worked. Though I'm not sure if any of his slides were actually shown at the Polytechnic, they were certainly available commercially. The next 3 slides are painted by Miss John Porter in 1854. They are transparencies that are borrowed from Cinematheque in Paris, and when I first saw them they were so beautiful that I had to borrow them, and because Cinematheque still show large format slides, they only show these copies. This is known as the Wrinkle. In other words, it's an ice skater skating. I believe it's the old Ali Pali ice rink. I've put my name to it, and I believe it's possibly made by John Beale, and it's a beautiful slide, articulated limbs. The body is painted within the articulated brass parts, so it goes around the ice rink. His arms go up and down, his legs bend, and he can lean over. Just very, very realistic, at the same time a very comical figure. Is a delight to watch when it's projected on the screen, and it's all part of the Wilkie collection that was bought in auction about 18 years ago. This is the old German legend of the Siren playing her harp, sitting on the banks in the Rhine and luring sailors to their death. And this is the sailor who's paddling over slowly, and he becomes almost within reach of her. And suddenly, tempest, turmoil, the rivers break, and he slowly sinks to his death. This is the owl that was used in Defrayed Shorts, a famous show put on by the Polytechnic. And the original was made by Mr. Child. This, I'm told, is a copy, but it's an authentic copy from many, many years ago of the owl. The owl spreads his wings and can fly away. his eyes move and his legs can retract into his body. So there are many moving parts on it. This is the snake from Der Feuchtschutz. It's animated, it's painted on mica. There are 5 sections that move. His mouth opens, his tongue comes out. This is the story of Gabriel Grubb, part of the Charles Dickens Christmas Carol stories, one of the many he's written. It's the story of the gravedigger. On Christmas Eve he has to go from the village, slowly plodding through with his shovel and his lamp, and in his pocket a bottle of whiskey, on his way to the graveyard to dig another grave. And there's a grumpy old fellow and he's saying, "Why am I doing this on Christmas Eve?" And he gets to the church and he sits on the tomb and he has a swig of his whiskey and falls asleep. And the goblins appear and a dozen of them dance round him, jump over him. Another series of effects that don't exist now. And they take him down to his cabin that is way down under the earth. And in the cabin he meets the king elf, the king imp. And the king imp talks to him about how miserable he's been to everybody. It's time that he saw the error of his ways. There is dissolving views where they project onto the cavern periods of his life where he's been mean to everybody, similar to the story of Scrooge. And then next morning he wakes up on the tomb with all these memories in his head, and he's a changed man, a man changed for the better.